Now, when you came out here to Omaha University in '55, were you a teacher, or did we have a radio and television department? What was here?
We had a speech department, headed, at the time I came, he came same year, by Al Paul, now retired, marvelous guy, did a lot for the speech department, and I was attached to that. But we started really sort of the radio TV department, which wasn't much of anything in that day. We had a little wired wireless fed down to the campus cafeteria in what is now the Arts and Science Hall, and we had an office that I had, a little studio next to it, and a control area, and another classroom. That was our broadcast area. And in there we had $15 made out of plywood cameras that a guy who was down at Channel 7 made to scale. And people would put their heads in those, move them around. We'd have a switcher, and they'd call shots, and we'd have television make-believe, you might say, and radio classes. But we had very little equipment, Tim, yeah.
And that was all over in what is now Arts and Sciences Hall?
Right, right.
And when did things get started here in the engineering building?
Well, that's kind of interesting. I was still part-time, I think, doing a little work at KMTV and doing a class or two or helping out in some way out here. And a guy named Paul Peterson, who was the head of journalism, came by and said, hey, we're going to build an applied arts building over in the west part of the campus. We want to put a studio area in there. Think of putting it up here on the second floor. On the second floor in a regular classroom area. Lousy. I may have given him a little general advice, but ultimately one day Al Paul was looking at the plans for this building that we're sitting in. And in the room we're sitting in was an open area under this large classroom up above us here where they can seat 300. And he said, why don't we put it there? In effect, and they did. And we have the place that's been used for thousands of programs and so on since, an added area for offices that was a classroom and office area, and it's been a pretty good setup over the years. Fortunately, with almost twice the headroom we would have had in a normal classroom, and probably making it possible for a lot of the things that followed in relation to the network and Channel 26 and that whole bit.
What year would that have been when this facility here was constructed?
Wow, let me think. We must have moved into it, Tim, and the tape will tell it, but I may be in error, but it must have been around 1960 or so, or 61. About 3-4 years before things really started to get rolling in terms of 26. We had some equipment, you know, we didn't have much anything. KMTV gave us the old black and white cameras, and we had the multiscope machine, and we actually used to do some live feeds of TV classroom from here down to KMTV on Saturday mornings, live at 7 in the morning. But we did class things, and we did things for the College of Education. We're starting to get involved with the other parts of the campus, but everything pretty much was done here. There wasn't any closed circuit capability, except eventually they added some of the rooms here for psychology and did a few things in that and biology with Dr. Ingham and with the psychology, the head of the psychology department, whose name escapes me, who went off to Oklahoma State, Bill James.
At that time, did many colleges or universities have a TV facility, or?
No, not really. Channel 12 was going along quite well in Lincoln, and it was a real pioneer in terms of broadcasting. But as far as departments, Tim, and doing it on campus and training people with a lot of equipment, there wasn't a lot of it around yet then, no. It really came on in a few years, but no, pretty thin.
Any students who stick in your mind as familiar names who many of us know today?
Oh, yeah. George Reagan, who's still on the staff here, was my first engineer, really, who helped put this place together in good measure. George was a student here when he first worked with me. John Slane, who's an executive with Union Pacific, he was one of our early helpers. I'd always seem like to have a student. We used so many students. Joe Horvath, who works for Mutual of Omaha now as an engineer in their operation, I believe. He was one of our early engineers. We had very few people, but we had some good ones. And we got started very modestly. And we were mainly doing class stuff, but then gradually we started to move in. Here came the state network. And they said, hey, well, we're going to put a channel in Omaha. There was a lot of bickering and fighting and politicking, but ultimately we ended up with one of the channels of the state network here on campus, licensed to the ETV Commission for the state, but housed, as it is still, here.
Of course, that was Channel 26.
Right.
And what year would that have been?
Let me think. About, I was thinking of 68, but that was too late. I think it was right around 68, I think, when we finally really got to it. But it was in that mid-60s period, generally.
Now, at that time, were you a full-time administrator in charge of the TV station, or did you continue to teach? Or?
Well, yeah, you see, that's the period, Tim, when it got to be fun to sort of not be teaching. I got out of it because here comes the network and this operation, and Metropolitan Omaha Educational Broadcasting, the local corporation Moeba, that helped fund this channel and the programs for in-school. We were making as many as 30 programs a week in this studio for use on the next week for in-school training for children. But anyway, and along with classes going on. But it was an exciting and interesting period, but you know, they needed some leadership, and I ended up part of my tab from the university and part of it from Moeba, being both places, but pretty much getting out of the classroom, yeah.
That was a busy time. I can remember my starting here of productions going on all the time here in the studios. And then it kind of tailed off a little bit, probably because of funding, do you think?
Yeah, that was a part of it, and eventually, of course, during the early part of it, we did most of it live. We had lousy tape equipment, and the money was so big for tape recorders. Remember, one of the last things the Board of Regents of the University of Omaha did was approve the money for 2 videotape recorders of the broadcast quality kind that we could really use. Wow, what a help that was.
Which we still have.
Yeah.
And probably still use.
Right.
You know, earlier you mentioned KMTV, and KMTV has been very close to this station for a number of years in terms of personnel and giving things. Hasn't that been true?
Oh, indeed so. They've given us, or given us at modest cost, thousands of dollars worth of equipment. And the hours, the hundreds of thousands of hours of airtime they've given us for TV Classroom. They've been a good friend, as has WOW and Channel 7 over the years too, but at the top of the class in that regard, I think, for our university, I'd say Channel 3, you bet. And of course, a lot of the people that are in the stations and around the stations, that are in management, have come from this place.
Of course, in 1968 was the merger when Omaha University joined the University of Nebraska system. What do you remember best about that time period?
Well, I think a lot of us entered it with real fear and trepidation, Tim. Wow, what's going to happen to us now? We've been a municipal university, but we were finding that was about the only way to go. I think basically it caused Dr. Bale to resign because the middle levy passage didn't go, you know, and he decided to quit a little bit early. But it was a hard time. And I think we all wondered what in the world really is going to become of us. And yet, on the other hand, too, it'd say, what are we going to do? We can't. I think if we hadn't merged into the university system at that time, probably we would have become either a fairly modest-sized university and or college of liberal arts, probably private, you know, or we'd have closed eventually. The dollars just weren't there. Well, the state support helped that, and look at the place now in 1987 and the growth in enrollment. The merger has done a lot of things, but it still left us with the feeling sometimes that we're sort of out there by ourselves. And it's hard to merge various campuses together, and it's a process, as you well know, Tim, that in 1987 is still going on.
Well, in the early 1970s, a big addition came to the operation here, and that was KVNO.
Yeah.
How did the station come about?
A number of people were interested in our getting a radio station. Let's get out of this just broadcasting on campus thing and get out. We're serving the community. We're an urban university. There's so many reasons for having it, you know. And it came to be. It came to be through the support of Jack Brillhart, Jack Newton, the chancellors and the presidents at that time, very modest amount of money really, and some government grants, and a long bunch of litigation in terms of the FCC and problems with the place to have it on the dial and everything. And we got an HEW grant and got enough equipment, able to set things up in the Storrs property over here, the former Storrs mansion, where it still is, but may move within the reasonable future, of course. Wonderful home for it.
I think that was around 1972.
And the first broadcast. We were going to be on about 8 hours a week. You know, I think Sunday through Saturday. You know, Sunday through Friday, or 1 day, or 6 days a week anyway. And the first broadcast was to be at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. We'd pre-taped it. Roskins, who was then the president here, had taped it. We had a special program. And I was off on vacation at the exact time that went on the air. And they pushed the switch and nothing happened. I mean, nothing happened. We didn't go on the air till 4:30 or whatever. The phone line that ran through a switching station out here had been wired wrong, and a guy out there went off shift at 4 o'clock. At the exact moment we were to go on, he pushed the switch and we went off the air before we went on. But fortunately, things improved.
I well remember that day of the embarrassment of trying to go on the air, and of course we had guests up there at the station and nothing happened. And of course at that time Fritz Lee was in charge of the station, and I think was probably pretty embarrassed and upset.
Fritz Lee, glad you mentioned him. He was our first station manager really under me, and he was a good one. Good man. Did a great job on getting us going with nothing practically, no budget, very little, student help almost completely, as we are still heavily using students.
The station over there has come a long way since 1972.
To 24-hour operation, stereo, the whole bit. It's great. It's a great improvement.